Hi, this is Check, and we're recording this on May 28th, 2020. And remember how the world needed ventilators? Remember Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, the guy that ordered nursing homes to take actively sick COVID patients? Uh, Remember that guy? He was screaming for ventilators, and if you couldn't provide the ventilators, you were no good, and blah, blah, blah. And then I don't know, we had to hire all these companies to make ventilators at huge amounts of money, and now we've got so many ventilators we literally are exporting them, which if they're really needed is a good thing. But are they really needed? Uh, Not too long ago, there were videos on the internet with doctors, some of them quite experienced, uh, and some of them very experienced with working with COVID patients, saying that the ventilators look like a bad idea, that the patients didn't necessarily need ventilators, they needed something else. But then we found a video with Tony Fauci, and Tony was kind of aware of the problem. He found it amusing, he found it interesting, but he didn't feel any urgency to do anything about it. So, how many, actually, before I ask the question, when's the last time you heard about ventilators? Are people still being put on them? In fact, they are. And when ventilators were being talked about, I mean, how many hundreds of news media hours were devoted to ventilators and intubation, the process of intubation? I would say hundreds of thousands of hours. I think there was no shortage of it. So there were hundreds of journalists, and they were all with their little sharp pencils and their little cell phones, dialing for information and, meeting their deadlines and digging deep and really serving the public, right? Well, let's learn something about the whole mechanical ventilation process, and let's learn about the process of intubation, because you can't put somebody on a ventilator unless you intubate them. Um, what does intubate mean? Well, it means to stick a pipe down their larynx into their lungs. Wow, that's pretty hardcore. Okay, let's look at what else is involved in this. First of all, the average person who's got a little trouble going to the dentist uh, is going to have a lot of trouble with somebody sticking a pipe down their throat. So, would you believe that drugs are needed to, quote, sedate people to get that to happen? And it's not just sedate them, we're talking about knocking them out. Bet you didn't know about that. I didn't. Did you know that when you're intubated, you're knocked out completely? Like, you're not sitting there with, with that pipe going, putting air into you and looking at the ceiling. You're gone. And that takes big drugs, non-stop drugs. So if you're intubated for a couple of days, you are drugged for a couple of days. If you're intubated for several weeks, and I just saw a case recently of a formerly healthy young man, right? That anomalous profile. We don't know whether he was healthy. He looked like I'm not going to mention his name, but he looked like a really heavy steroid user. And somehow he ended up in the clutches of some intubating physicians, and he spent 6 weeks under. Now, when you're 6 weeks under, where do you go for lunch? You don't. They stick a tube in your arm, a plastic tube, and they feed you intravenously. You don't have solid food. You can't have solid food because one of the dangers of being intubated is you might throw up and you might choke to death on your own vomit. Now, pardon me for the graphic nature of this, but isn't this like one of the biggest stories of the century? Isn't ventilating people, putting them on mechanical ventilators, like the big deal? Wasn't it the big deal for weeks and weeks and weeks? And yet, I had to do a little research to find this out. I sure didn't get it from the friendly neighborhood mainstream news media or the so-called independent media or the so-called radical media. I don't know where these guys are. Do you? I have never seen such, like we're 2+ months into this, and if you count uh, the Wuhan uh, charade, this started in January. And even the most basic things about the mechanics. See, here's the deal. Life is logistics. The rubber's gotta meet the road. Someone's gotta go from point A to point B. Things don't happen magically, unless, of course, you're talking about the spread of COVID. Things have to follow a logistical logic. So when people are talking about ventilators and intubation, which they mentioned a lot less, but you can't have one without the other, you would have thought that somebody would have spent a little time to get into what it actually means to put someone on a mechanical ventilator. Is it a surprise that in older patients, people 65 and older, that more than 90% of the people put on a mechanical ventilator died? Well, let's look at what could have killed them. Number one, the wide range of drugs that are required to intubate somebody. I'm going to get into that in a second. Some of those drugs that are used, that are necessary, are opioids. Opioids have been known for over 100 years to depress lung function. Oh, that's interesting. We got somebody that can't breathe. Let's stick a pipe down his throat, knock him out, and to help him deal with the pain, because imagine how painful it is. We'll give him some fentanyl. Yes, indeed. These patients are given fentanyl. That's the drug that's killing people, supposedly healthy young people, left and right. We're giving it to people in their 70s, 80s. I don't know if they put any 90-year-olds on a ventilator. But it's just very interesting that the reality of mechanical ventilation just is not discussed. So is it possible that the drugs are killing people? People are often talking about the damage that COVID does to people's lungs, or they used to talk about that. They're talking about that less, but that was one of the horrors of COVID. Well, it turns out, and you only need the internet to find this out, and I didn't know till I looked either, everybody who's put on a mechanical ventilator ends up with damaged lungs. And if you have the Keystone, the medical version of the Keystone cops doing the procedure, which does happen, I've witnessed it myself, not in intubation, but in other emergency situations, where you kind of watch the guys doing what they're doing and you can't believe how inept they are at a basic procedure. Is it possible? Well, it's not just possible. We know it's not even a matter of conjecture that intubating people and keeping them on a mechanical ventilator for days or weeks is going to injure the lungs. Now, if somebody's come in there with lung function problems and you injure their lungs and they're already older and they're already sick with 3 or 4 or 5 or half a dozen or dozen different things, do you think you might push them over the edge and kill them? It's possible, right? It's in the realm of possibility. Actually, we're fine. The news media doesn't want to look at a basic fact, and that's between depends on how you cut it, 200,000 and 400,000 people die in the United States every year in the hospital due to medical mistakes. All right, let me repeat that again. Every year, not just COVID year, every year, 200,000 to 400,000 people die in U.S. hospitals due to medical mistakes. Okay? That's when there's an admission of mistake, and believe me, doctors bury their mistakes, and hospital administrators bury doctors who fail to bury their mistakes. So there's a whole lot of burying of facts going on. Do we know the exact number? No, because nobody's bothering to measure it. Are there people who've made their life study of this topic? Yes, there are. This is the number they've come up with. So it's not unknown for a hospital to make a mistake and kill an otherwise healthy patient or someone that could have made it. So this is not something that's so wild and out of the realm of possibility. In fact, it's well within the realm of possibility. And notice we said killed in the hospital. We're not talking about people that were misdiagnosed, put on drugs that were dangerous, that killed them at home. We don't know what that number is. We know that just one drug alone, Vioxx, which Merck marketed as a headache remedy, is thought to have killed by heart attack up to 500,000 people. That's one drug. That's just one drug. So we have to open our minds to the horrible possibility that when you see a COVID death and intubation and a mechanical ventilator is involved, the heroes might have killed the patient. And I know everybody's a hero, and you know what, it's a job. They get paid for it. They're not really risking their lives. I know we like to pretend, or we're told that it's a horrendous risk to be doing what they're doing. It's not like being on the front lines for real. But I don't want to go too far off on that tangent. But in any event, it is not unheard of for doctors and their staffs to kill patients. Now, if patients are coming in, they're already on the older side, they already have some comorbidities, and people are freaking out about the patients and jumping the gun and drugging them fast, and then deciding that they need to intubate them and put them on a ventilator fast. Here's some of the drugs. Oh, by the way, the other thing, besides just plain garden variety trauma, the other thing risk when you intubate somebody is infection, which kind of makes sense. You're taking a foreign object and sticking it where it really shouldn't be. And if you're careless, and how many people die of infections caught in the hospital every year? That's about 100,000 a year. That's the ones we know about. So infections are not that rare. They happen. All right, so there's a pre-treatment phase, and this is given before you stick. They call it intubation, but we're basically saying sticking the pipe down the guy's throat into his lungs. Okay, so here's what you give him. You give him some lidocaine, and this is done to protect the patient theoretically from increases in intracranial pressure caused by the intubation. Then you give the patient, this is all pre-intubation, some fentanyl. Then you give the patient, or you used to give the patient, depends, you never know. Like there was a policy and then the policy changed. Did everybody get the memo? Maybe, maybe not. You give the patient something called rocuronium. Then there's the induction agents. Okay, and then they recommend, this is for the induction stage, thiopental. And it can have some adverse effects, could cause histamine release, could cause myocardial depression. It could cause vasodilation, could cause hypotension. And the note is avoid intra-arterial injection because it may cause gangrene. So that's one of the things they like to use. What else do they like to use in the process of intubating somebody? They like to use something called midazolam. And there's a note here. It might cause respiratory depression, which is so interesting because they're there because they're having breathing problems or oxygen processing problems. So let's give them something that could cause respiratory depression, could cause apnea. We all know what that is. Um, could cause something called paradoxical agitation. I don't really know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. And in the notes, they say patient response may be extremely variable. In other words, we don't know what's going to happen when you give them this, but just be prepared. Then the next drug they like is something called etomidate. And, you know, could cause pain when they inject it. And definitely make sure you let the people that treat this poor fellow afterwards that you gave it to him, especially if the guy becomes septic. Because apparently that's something that happens when you inject etomidate. And by the way, these are all injections, right? These are not little pills that you take. And then ketamine. And there's a warning here, use caution in patients with cardiovascular disease. Do they use caution? I don't know. Do they make mistakes? I don't know. Do they have all the information about the patient before they give him his shot of ketamine? I don't know. Is it possible they make mistakes sometimes? I think they do. And then we have something called propofol. Could cause myocardial depression. Don't worry about that. Then we have some drugs to paralyze the patient because you need to paralyze these guys. Otherwise, they're going to thrash around in their sleep. So something called bradycardia. Sounds like something related to heart may occur after repeated doses. Have some atropine ready in case. Then we've got another drug called rocuronium. And they say not many clinically significant adverse effects. But in the comments, have a contingency plan in place in case of the event of a failed airway, because that's most inconvenient. When those airways fail, not good, not good. Then they have another drug they like called vecuronium. No significant problems in terms of adverse effects. However, you know what? You know what we said about rocuronium? Same thing for vecuronium. Have a plan in place just in case his airway fails. So that's one set of drugs. Let me see what else they got. And we're not talking about one. We're talking about all of them. Or not all of them, but for each stage, you need to give somebody, for the for the setup, for the sedation part and the analgesia part. Analgesia being pain relief. Sedation being knock them out. And then there's another drug called succinylcholine. You should avoid it if the patient's had burns or crush injuries that are new or spinal cord injury or any of that stuff. About 1 out of 15,000 children have a genetic susceptibility to it. And you should always have some atropine handy because you might need it to save the person's life. So that's the paralysis. This is, I'm looking at a different set of papers, but these talk about the pre-treatment again, the sedation and analgesia, which is the part where you're inserting the tube, putting everything in place, and then the drugs you need to paralyze the patient for an indefinite length of time. Then there's topical anesthesia that you might want to use if that's possible too. But anyway, I think the point's clear. They're using, you need a lot of drugs to intubate somebody, and you need a lot of drugs to keep somebody on a mechanical ventilator. And I watch the news. I've listened to all the geniuses on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and Rachel Maddow and all these guys who know so much, and I've listened to the governors, and they know so much about medicine, and of course Dr. Fauci, he knows everything about medicine, and I haven't heard anybody mention that every intubation is a big pharma payday. I mean, it's because it's not like one shot and you're done. some of these drugs you have to you have to keep the person paralyzed continuously for days or weeks. And it looks like to me, just from reading this, a whole lot of things can go wrong, which leads us to this. A lot of nurses who went to New York City to frankly find work because they didn't have work at home uh, were kind of shocked at the things they saw in New York City hospitals, especially the public hospitals. But I really don't think the private ones are really that much better. And what amazed them is they'd intubate people and kind of just leave them because they were so super infectious. Well, you can't really leave people that are on a mechanical ventilator too long, right? And you can't really neglect them unless you're not too worried about their future life. And this may also explain the death rate on mechanical ventilators for people 65 and older, which is 90% up, 90% and up. By the way, ketamine, this one is a little bit more descriptive. Um, it's a dissociative anesthetic. So basically, I mean, that's why it's a party drug, but it creates a dissociative state so that you're kind of aware, but you're dissociated from everything that's going on around you. So there we are. We've got COVID, the biggest story of the century. We've got ventilators, one of the big themes, certainly for several weeks. It was all that anybody could talk about. And here we are in late May, and I don't know about you, but until I was able to get around to actually reading the fine print and the logistics of intubation and mechanical ventilators, I had no idea the level of drugging that these people were subjected to. And we just have to ask the question, who could survive this? You'd have to be you'd have to be in pretty good shape to be subjected to all these different drug treatments and survive. And then this takes us back to that number of 200,000 to 400,000 patients in the United States killed by medical error in hospitals. And then we have to remember those videos of sincere, and I even though I rail against the profession because boy do they deserve it, but I know there are people that are sincere in medicine. And we had a video of a seemingly very sincere ICU doctor expressing his concerns and his doubts about this ventilators for all business, which is what was being pushed by Governor Andrew Cuomo. By the way, Governor Andrew Cuomo just signed a law or passed a law, I don't know what he did, signed a proclamation, gave an edict that if you run a nursing home, you're not responsible for anything. You're not responsible for neglect. You're not responsible for abuse. And you're not responsible for deaths. How's that? And then this, the very same day after signing that, he had Chris Rock and Rosie Perez, two PhDs in emergency medicine, get on the podium with him and talk about how we all have to wear masks. Because if we don't wear masks, it's going to be the end of the world. Now, the thing they have to know about Andrew Cuomo and Chris Cuomo, his brother, the clown on CNN, and if you haven't seen that clown show, you do not need to go to Ringling Brothers. You can just stay home, put your feet up, and watch Chris Cuomo. And they're brothers, and their dad was Mario Cuomo, who was governor of New York. And the Tweedledee-Dum and Tweedledee-Dee, the two Cuomo brothers, were in their 20s when Mario was governor of New York State. And you better believe that Fauci was very, very close to Mario Cuomo because, New York's sort of one of the big gates, one of the big swinging gates that you need to control if you're engaged in a full court press public health propaganda operation, which Fauci is constantly involved in. And back when Mario was governor, it was his AIDS scam. If you haven't seen our videos on the AIDS scam, you really should. You really should. The exact playbook that Fauci and friends used to defraud the American public and the world out of many billions of dollars, and in the process kill hundreds of thousands of people, both here and overseas, is the same exact playbook they're using for COVID. I mean, there's really not a whole lot of difference. Um, but anyway, Fauci and the Cuomos know each other very well. And Chris Cuomo of CNN, he of the big mouth, admitted that Fauci's on the phone with him every day, sometimes several times a day. Now that's kind of interesting, don't you think? That the head of infectious diseases for America has time to be talking with a news media clown? But then again, maybe it's not so unusual, because what is Fauci's real job? No one I know who's a real scientist thinks he's a scientist, thinks Fauci's a scientist. No one I know who's a real doctor thinks Fauci's a real doctor. No one I know who's a researcher thinks Fauci's a real researcher. So what the heck is Fauci? Well, Fauci's a bureaucrat. And he's had the same very powerful, very lucrative position since 1984. 36 years. Count them. Do you think he got there by being a great scientist? Do you think he keeps that job by being a great scientist? He keeps that job by making sure he controls the narrative. And that includes, apparently, according to Chris Cuomo, personal phone calls. Now, let me ask you this. If Tony Fauci has time to call a television clown named Chris Cuomo, do you think he might have some time to call the governor of New York State, where the epicenter of the COVID crisis? I bet if there were any real journalists in this world and they did a Freedom of Information Act on Fauci's phone and on Cuomo's phones, I think we'd find they talk together a lot. So that makes things very interesting. That means that all the screaming and yelling about ventilators, where did that come from? Andrew Cuomo doesn't know anything about medicine, not a thing. So somebody had to tell him. Was it his public health guru? Maybe. Could it have been Tony Fauci? Because for some reason, and none of the world's greatest investigative reporters working for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and all these great Washington Post, LA Times, they're just knocking it out of the park with their deep research. None of them have been able to trace where the ventilator hysteria came from. It's like so many things in this story. It just was. It just became accepted as fact. So, given logistics, it's possible that the person pumping Andrew Cuomo full of "we need respirators" was none other than Tony Fauci. It's very possible. What's also very interesting is we know that Fauci was talking with Chris Cuomo. We can guess that he was talking with a man 100 times more important, his brother, who he knew and could certainly pick up the phone and call and certainly wanted to influence. Is it possible that Fauci overlooked the small detail that you shouldn't put active COVID cases in a nursing home? I mean, what else would these guys have been talking about? I assume they were talking about protecting the public good. Didn't we know way back when this was in China that it was older people that were subjected to that were dying from this? We certainly knew in Italy. And it turns out, by the way, lots of connections between Tony Fauci and the Italian medical establishment, more than the average country. So certainly Fauci knew that you had to take special care with older people and certainly special care with people that were quite sick. And it's just interesting, assuming that he and Andrew Cuomo did a lot of talking together, that whole subject of ventilators never came up. So what did come up? What were they talking about? What did Fauci talk with Chris Cuomo about? I mean, it's really charming. Chris Cuomo tells a really charming, heartwarming story about all the personal calls he received from Fauci. But what were they talking about? I heard this was a busy guy. He had a lot on his plate. It's hard to imagine that he had time to make personal phone calls to Cuomo, but apparently he did. So, this thing is very mysterious. The more you look at it, the more mysterious it gets. The more you look at it, the more amazing it is that the news media is not doing any really reporting at all. They've got their little scoreboard, and they show the cumulative number of deaths. I mean, why not show the cumulative number of deaths of people that have died from automobile accidents in the last 12 months? That's pretty shocking. Hey, how about this? Why not show the cumulative number of deaths of people who've died in hospitals by medical mistakes for the last 12 months? That would be pretty interesting. How about this? Why don't we have a running clock that shows the total lifetime cumulative deaths of Americans in hospitals? Because if it is in fact even as low as 200,000 a year, in a 10-year period, that's 2 million people. Now that would be a really interesting scoreboard to run every day in flashing red on CNN. I think that would be really interesting. I have a feeling we're not going to see that. And we're not going to see that because of what is one of the roots of all evil in all this, which is that we allow pharmaceutical companies to advertise and therefore control and therefore subvert television journalism in America. No other country in the world allows drug companies to buy TV ads except New Zealand. We're it. And that is a grave mistake. And that is something that we absolutely need to correct. Because if the news media was not getting paid to represent the interests of pharma and put them in the best light, they might suddenly get interested in the drama of people going into the hospital, being intubated, being pumped with half a dozen pretty powerful and, according to the labels, dangerous drugs and dying. That may suddenly become interesting to them because we know it's definitely not interesting to them now. So that's the Brass Check Report. Please share. I don't think this information's anywhere else right now, and I think it's quite relevant to what's going on.